When Madison Clare stepped onto that stage with tears still fresh on her cheeks, nobody expected what happened next. The four celebrity judges had their backs turned, ready to hit their buzzers and send another hopeful contestant home. But then she opened her mouth, and in that moment, everything changed forever. Just 12 hours earlier, Madison had been scrubbing ketchup out her blonde hair in the girls' bathroom at Lincoln High School. Jessica Parker and her crew had cornered her during lunch again, this time dumping an entire tray of food over her head while the cafeteria erupted in laughter. Madison had learned not to fight back anymore. Fighting back only made it worse. She had been the target for 3 long years now, ever since her family lost their house and moved to the trailer park on the wrong side of town. Her father, once a successful contractor, now worked double shifts at the local factory just to keep food on the table. Her mother had taken a job cleaning offices at night, coming home exhausted and hollow-eyed each morning. Madison wore the same 5 outfits to school, rotated carefully to avoid too much repetition, and carried her books in a backpack held together with duct tape. But none of that mattered to Jessica Parker, the mayor's daughter who ruled Lincoln High with an iron fist and a credit card that never seemed to reach its limit. Jessica had made it her personal mission to remind Madison daily of her place, at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The names they called her echoed in her mind long after she left school each day. Trailer trash, loser, nobody. Madison had one escape, one place where the cruel words couldn't reach her. Every night after her parents fell asleep, exhausted from their backbreaking work, she would slip out to the old oak tree behind their trailer. There, under the stars, she would sing, not for anyone else, not for recognition or praise, but because something deep inside her soul demanded it. Her voice would float across the empty fields, carrying melodies that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her 17 years of pain. She had been singing since she was 4 years old, back when they lived in the big house on Maple Street, and her biggest worry was which Disney princess dress to wear. Her mother used to say she had the voice of an angel, but those days felt like a lifetime ago. Now, singing was her secret, her shame, her desperate attempt to feel something other than worthless. The bullying had gotten worse lately. Last week, Jessica had started a rumor that Madison's family couldn't afford soap, leading to whispers and pointing fingers everywhere she went. 2 days ago, someone had spray-painted "Freak" on her locker in bright red letters. Yesterday, she had found a note in her backpack that simply read, "Why don't you just disappear?" Madison had been asking herself that same question for months. But fate has a strange way of intervening when we least expect it. That Tuesday morning, as Madison sat alone at her usual table in the far corner of the cafeteria, trying to make her free school lunch last as long as possible, she overheard a conversation that would change everything. 2 seniors at the next table were talking about the voice auditions coming to Oklahoma City that weekend. One of them mentioned how their cousin had tried out last year and made it to the battle rounds. Madison's heart started racing. She had watched every season of the show religiously, imagining what it would feel like to stand on that stage, to have someone believe in her talent. But the thought had always seemed as impossible as flying to the moon. That afternoon, as she walked home past the usual gauntlet of snickering classmates, Madison made a decision that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She was going to audition. She spent the next 3 days in secret preparation, practicing her song choice over and over under the old oak tree. She had chosen Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen, a song that captured every ounce of pain and hope she carried in her chest. Her mother's old guitar, the one gathering dust in the closet since they'd moved to the trailer, became her constant companion. Getting to Oklahoma City was another challenge entirely. Madison had exactly $43 to her name, saved from babysitting the neighbor's twin boys on weekends. The bus ticket would cost $35, leaving her with just enough for a candy bar and maybe a soda. She told her parents she was spending the day at the library, hating herself for the lie, but knowing they would never understand. The Greyhound bus ride took 2 hours, and with every mile, Madison's courage began to falter. What was she doing? Who did she think she was? Girls like her didn't get discovered. Girls like her stayed invisible, graduated quietly, and faded into lives of quiet desperation just like their parents. When she arrived at the audition venue, her fears seemed justified. Thousands of hopeful singers had gathered, most of them looking like they'd stepped out of music videos. Professional vocal coaches accompanied some contestants. Others had entire teams of family members wearing matching T-shirts with their names bedazzled across the front. Madison stood in line alone, wearing her best dress, which was actually a hand-me-down from her cousin that was 2 sizes too big. The other contestants barely glanced at her. When they did, she caught the familiar look of dismissal she knew so well from school. One girl with perfectly styled hair looked her up and down and whispered something to her friend that made them both laugh. Madison felt the old shame creeping in, the voice in her head that sounded suspiciously like Jessica Parker telling her she didn't belong here. Hours passed. Madison's feet ached in her uncomfortable shoes, and her stomach growled loudly enough that the boy in front of her turned around with a smirk. She watched the contestant after contestant disappear behind the audition doors, some emerging with tears of joy, others with disappointment etched across their faces. Finally, after 6 grueling hours, they called her number. Madison's hands were shaking as she followed production assistant down a long hallway toward the famous red door she had seen on television so many times. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and for a moment she considered turning around and running back to the bus station. But then she thought about Jessica Parker's cruel laughter, about the word freak spray-painted on her locker, about her parents working themselves to death just to survive. She thought about all the nights she had sung to the stars, pouring her heart out to the universe and receiving only silence in return. Maybe it was time to let someone else hear what she had been keeping locked away. The doors opened, and Madison found herself in a smaller room with 4 producers seated behind a table. This was a preliminary audition. She realized if she passed this round, she would get to perform for the celebrity judges on the famous stage. The producers looked bored, like they had already seen 1,000 mediocre singers that day and were ready to go home. One of them glanced up from his clipboard with barely concealed impatience. Name and song choice? Madison Clare, she whispered, then cleared her throat and tried again. Madison Clare, and I'll be singing Hallelujah. She saw one producer roll his eyes. Another sighed audibly. Clearly, they had heard this song butchered by countless hopefuls before her. Madison's confidence crumbled a little more. Whenever you're ready, the woman in the center said, not even looking up from her papers. Madison closed her eyes and tried to find that place inside herself where the music lived. She thought about the oak tree, about the stars that had been her only audience for so many years. She thought about her parents, sacrificing everything for their family. She thought about every cruel word, every humiliation, every moment she had felt invisible and worthless. And then she began to sing. The first note that emerged from Madison's lips was like nothing anyone in that room had ever heard. It was pure, haunting, filled with a pain and beauty that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her 17 years. The producers looked up from their paperwork, their expressions shifting from bored indifference to stunned attention. As Madison continued, her voice grew stronger and more confident. She wasn't thinking about the judges anymore, or the other contestants, or Jessica Parker's cruel laughter. She was thinking about every person who had ever felt invisible, who had ever been told they weren't enough, who had ever wondered if their voice mattered at all. When she finished, the room was completely silent. The 4 producers stared at her with their mouths slightly open, as if they couldn't quite believe what they had just witnessed. Finally, the woman in the center spoke. Madison, she said softly, how old are you? 17, ma'am. And where did you learn to sing like that? Madison thought about all the lessons she had never taken, all the opportunities she had never had. My backyard, she said simply. The producers exchanged glances, and Madison saw something she had never seen directed at her before. Respect, admiration, maybe even a little awe. Madison, the head producer said, standing up from behind the table, congratulations. You're going through to sing for the judges. 3 days later, Madison found herself standing backstage at the main audition venue, waiting for her moment. The producers had given her a makeover, but she had asked them to keep it simple. She wanted to be herself up there, not some manufactured version of what they thought a star should look like. As she waited in the wings, Watching other contestants perform for her coaches Blake Shelton, Kelly Clarkson, John Legend, and Camila Cabello, Madison's nerves began to get the better of her. These were real celebrities, Grammy winners, people she had only dreamed of meeting. What would they think of a trailer park girl with a second-hand dress and a heart full of broken dreams? Her phone buzzed with a text message, and her heart sank when she saw it was from Jessica Parker. Even here, hundreds of miles from Lincoln High, the bullying followed her. The message was a screenshot from social media showing Madison getting off the bus in Oklahoma City with a caption that read, "Look who thinks she's going to be famous. Can't wait to see this train wreck." For a moment, all of Madison's old insecurities came flooding back. She was nobody special, just a poor girl from the wrong side of town who had fooled herself into thinking she had something valuable to offer. The familiar voice in her head whispered that she should run, that she should disappear before she embarrassed herself in front of millions of viewers. But then she heard her name being called. It was time. Madison walked onto that stage with tears in her eyes, partly from fear and partly from the overwhelming weight of the moment. This was it. This was her chance to prove that she was more than the sum of her circumstances, more than the cruel labels others had placed on her. The 4 judges sat with their backs to her in their famous red chairs. Blake was laughing at something Kelly had said. John was reviewing notes on his tablet. Camila was warming up her voice. None of them were paying attention to the nervous girl standing center stage. Madison approached the microphone and looked out at the live audience. Hundreds of faces stared back at her, some curious, some skeptical, some already reaching for their phones to capture what they assumed to be another forgettable audition. She closed her eyes and found her center, that quiet place where the music lived. She thought about the oak tree, about her parents' sacrifice, about every person who had ever made her feel small. And then she thought about something else. She thought about every person who had ever felt the way she felt, every kid who had been bullied, every family struggling to make ends meet, every dreamer who had been told they weren't good enough. This wasn't just for her anymore. This was for all of them. Madison opened her mouth and sang the first note of Hallelujah. The effect was immediate and electric. Blake's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. Kelly's eyes widened as she slowly turned in her chair to locate the source of that incredible sound. John looked up from his tablet with an expression of complete surprise. Camila stopped her vocal warm-ups and listened with the intensity of someone hearing a miracle. But Madison was just getting started. As she moved into the second verse, her voice soared with power and emotion that seemed to fill every corner of the massive studio. The audience, which had been chattering quietly, fell into complete silence. Camera operators stopped adjusting their equipment. Even the hardened television crew members paused what they were doing to listen. One by one, the judges began to turn their chairs. Kelly was first, spinning around with tears already forming in her eyes. Blake followed seconds later, his usual playful expression replaced by one of awe. John turned during the chorus, nodding appreciatively as he recognized true artistry. And finally, as Madison reached the climactic bridge of the song, Camila slammed her hand on her button, completing the clean sweep. But Madison didn't see any of this. She was lost in the song, lost in the moment, pouring years of pain and hope and dreams into every note. When she finally opened her eyes and saw all 4 judges facing her, their expressions ranging from stunned to moved to inspired, she nearly forgot to breathe. The audience erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. Blake stood up from his chair, shaking his head in disbelief. Kelly was crying openly. John was clapping so hard his hands must have hurt. Camila was beaming with the kind of smile reserved for witnessing something truly special. But the most important moment came after the cameras stopped rolling. As Madison walked off stage, her phone buzzed with dozens of notifications. The video of her audition had already been posted online, and it was spreading like wildfire. But among all the comments and shares and reactions, one message stood out. It was from her mother. "Honey, I just saw it online. I'm so proud of you. We're all proud of you. Come home soon so we can celebrate." 3 months later, Madison made it to the finale of The Voice. She didn't win, but that hardly mattered. Record labels were calling. Concert venues wanted to book her. Most importantly, She had found her voice in more ways than one. When she returned to Lincoln High for graduation, something had changed, not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. Jessica Parker tried to make one last cruel comment as Madison walked across the stage to receive her diploma, but Madison simply smiled and kept walking. The words had no power over her anymore. After the ceremony, Madison drove out to the old oak tree one last time before leaving for Nashville. As she sat beneath its branches, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The bullying, the pain, the nights of feeling invisible and worthless. They had all led to this moment. They had shaped her voice, given it the depth and authenticity that had moved millions of people around the world. Madison realized that sometimes our greatest struggles become our greatest strengths. Sometimes the very thing that makes us feel different, isolated, or broken is the same thing that makes us extraordinary. The girl who had once been ashamed of her circumstances now understood that they had been preparing her for something bigger than she ever could have imagined. As she drove away from the trailer park for the last time, Madison smiled. She had spent years trying to disappear, trying to make herself invisible to avoid the pain of being seen. But she had learned something important. Being invisible is not the same as being safe, and being seen is not the same as being vulnerable. Sometimes, being seen is the most powerful thing you can do. Her voice had always been there, waiting for the courage to let it out. All those nights singing to the stars hadn't been practiced for someday. They had been preparing her for the moment when she would realize that her voice, her story, her truth were worth sharing with the world. Madison's story reminds us that everyone has a voice worth hearing, a story worth telling, a gift worth sharing. Sometimes we just need the courage to step onto stage, open our mouths, and trust that what comes out will be enough. Because most of the time, it's more than enough. Most of the time, it's exactly what the world needs to hear. The girl they once called nobody had become somebody not by changing who she was, but by finally having the courage to be who she had always been. And in doing so, she gave permission to countless others to do the same.